Welcome back to Telltale Books. This video I want to discuss a topic, one that relates to other topics I've been discussing lately and other stories I've been investigating and the bibliographies I've been building on our websites. It's led me to a conclusion. In particular, that when I was younger, reading books about the history of science fiction, the essays that I read about the history of science fiction were very centric to the United States of America. And it is true that most of the publishing was happening in the United States of America. Just like with movies, most of the movies have been made in Hollywood. That doesn't mean that all the best directors were working in Hollywood, or even that they were all originally from Hollywood. Like Alfred Hitchcock, he did eventually go out and work in Hollywood, but he's a British director and spent a lot of time in British films. Anyway, I've realized that the perception I had of science fiction being very American and other countries just had a little bit here and there was not accurate. Specifically, I'm seeing where there are a lot more British authors, and a lot of those British authors have had a lot more influence over science fiction, the development of the genre over the years, than what my perception was from articles and such that I read. A lot of my perception about the history of science fiction, particularly in the Golden Age, came from essays written by Isaac Asimov, introductions to his books, introductions to other books. It seemed very much like science fiction was an American thing. And okay, yeah, there were British authors. Yeah, there were some French authors. Yeah, there are other authors around the world, but they were never significant. It always seemed like all the significant activity in science fiction was happening here in the United States of America. While there was a lot going on here, the main reason why it seemed like science fiction was a United States thing or an American thing is because the publishing was here. The big publishers were in the United States. Most of the magazines were founded here in the United States. Amazing Stories, Astounding Stories, Planet Stories, Galaxy, those were all here in the United States. Fantasy and science fiction also. So the publishing was mostly here in the United States. And it is true that there were some British science fiction magazines in the late 1930s. They mostly stayed small. They mostly didn't last long. They mostly weren't too significant. It wasn't until New Worlds came along in the 1950s that you really had a significant market for science fiction in the UK. New Worlds, and I believe there's a couple others that were happening at the time, but that was all after the Golden Age was pretty much over. There were 4 or 5 in the late 1930s that got going, but never achieved the success of, say, Astounding Stories. So the British authors that existed back then, if they wanted to sell their fiction, they had to sell to the American market. And so it was all published here in the United States. But there were quite a lot of, I mean, going back before the magazines, before there was anything going on with science fiction in the United States, you had, Jules Verne in France, Mary Shelley, and H.G. Wells in England, and then you had other authors like Arthur Conan Doyle, again in England, H. Rider Haggard, England, mostly British authors until Edgar Rice Burroughs comes along. And he was an American author. And then, of course, Hugo Gernsback starting Amazing Stories, and now you had the growth of some Native American, not really Native American, but, some authors living in the United States coming out and starting to publish in the science fiction magazines. And so then you had Jack Williamson and Clifford Simak, and on the Weird Tales side, H.P. Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard. They were here in the United States. But the reality is there were authors even back then, many of them publishing in the American magazines, but they were British authors, people like John Taine, Eric Frank Russell. Later in the 40s, you had, well, actually in the late 1930s, Arthur C. Clarke started writing. So you had Arthur C. Clarke, all British. And in the 1950s, you had a much bigger explosion of it, probably prompted by magazines like New Worlds being established over there. Now all of a sudden you've got Michael Moorcock and J.G. Ballard and Brian Aldiss and Harry Harrison and a whole host of British science fiction authors kind of exploding. But at the same time, you had a lot of authors exploding here in the United States. But what I've been realizing in my activities with Telltale is finding out, number one, that there were a lot more British authors doing a lot more significant things as early as the 1930s, other than H.G. Wells. And so you can't really say, just because all the publishing was happening here in the United States, you can't really call it entirely an American phenomenon. A lot of British authors were contributing, and the ones that were contributing the best stories in a lot of instances. So then, of course, 1950s come along, New Worlds comes along, a lot of new authors come along, a lot of them were British. You go through the bibliographies of the different authors, and you just keep running across that, yes, there were a lot in the United States, but there were a lot in Britain. And so at the very, and in Canada, for that matter, Canada. And so maybe you can't really call science fiction then so much an American phenomenon like it seemed to me when I was growing up, just because the magazines were here in the United States. It was involving a lot of authors that did not live here. They lived in Canada, they lived in Great Britain. They were publishing in the United States, but that's because the publishing was here. So I'm finding time and time again, favorite authors, favorite stories, favorite books, British. No matter where they were published, it's British. You might be able to say that science fiction was mostly, not entirely, but mostly an English-speaking phenomenon, because you look for German, Italian, French, Spanish. I mean, they're there, but very small numbers of authors from countries like that. And of course, third world countries, very, very small. They were there, but not much. Not like here in the United States. And there again, I think it's mostly opportunity. The opportunity was existing in the English-speaking world, where it just didn't exist in third world countries or even European countries of other languages. It was a lot more limited. So I just wanted to shoot a quick video talking about how I've been discovering how important British authors have been, not just to the history of science fiction, but to my personal experience with science fiction. And how I got started thinking about this, frankly, was from the fact that a lot of you viewers are not in the United States. I notice you leaving comments at, for my time, 2 in the morning, and it's like, wait a minute, these people are either not living in the United States or they're staying up all night. So there's a lot of people outside the United States that are watching my videos here, and that's what got me thinking. And so I started looking at BookTube in general and seeing where there's just a larger percentage of BookTube videos where they clearly are in the British Isles or Australia or Canada, because they're speaking with, not a United States accent. I don't want to call it a British accent because Australia and Canada are a little different, but I can tell they're not living in the United States, and some of them will even say that yes, they're in Canada or they're in England, they're in London, whatever. And it has me thinking that there's just, especially in England, there is a different attitude towards reading. My perception, by watching BookTube, by seeing the number of BookTube video producers that are obviously in England, my perception then is that there must be a much larger, much stronger readership in England than there is here in the United States, which wouldn't surprise me. I mean, we do have and this isn't a recent thing. As long as I've been alive, the United States has had very much of an anti-intellectual culture, which is strange since we prided ourselves on being ahead of everybody technologically. That so many people in this country have a suspicion of learning and knowledge. So hey, if that's true, if my perception is right, if people in the United States are really only interested in reading Twilight books and the rest of the world is interested in Charles Dickens and H.G. Wells and Ernest Hemingway and the great science fiction authors and great fantasy authors. If that's the case, then more power to everybody else in the world. I will do whatever I can to cater to you, and I will continue to move forward with my personal taste. If it takes me down the line of mostly reading British authors, and so be it. Though I also would like to discover more international authors. I've done very little reading outside of US, Canada, Great Britain literature. And of course, well, I only speak American English, so anything I read has got to be translated if it's coming from another country. But fortunately, there are a lot of good translations. Another British author, Brian Stableford, I notice he has translated a lot of French science fiction. I want to look that up and start reading some of that. And of course, the other classics, other Italian authors, other French authors, Japanese authors. I want to read something by Kobo Abe. I haven't read anything, and I'm probably murdering names. I apologize in advance. Koboabe. Kobo Abe? I don't know. I've only seen it in print. I've never heard it pronounced. But books like The Woman in the Dunes, I want to read some of their work. And, of course, Murakami. Murakami has been gaining a lot of attention. And I've got a beautiful copy of Kafka on the Shore. I want to read those. And I would like to discover more authors from around the world if I can. But if I end up liking mostly British authors, I'm not going to apologize for it. So be it. And that's all I got for this video. just wanted to talk a little bit about that perception of how, even though I thought science fiction was primarily American, I've mostly been reading and liking British authors. Very interesting fact. Till next time, like us, subscribe to us, leave your comments, tell me that I'm an idiot. Tell me that it was obvious that all along that I should have seen it. And come on back and watch more. I've got a lot more videos to do, a lot more things to talk about, especially once I get into those other authors that I mentioned.